September 1945, southern Japan. The air still smells faintly of burned wood and wet ash. Streets are quiet except for distant boots on gravel. American occupation trucks idle near what used to be a schoolyard. Children stand in a loose line. Thin arms, oversized clothing stitched from old uniforms. Many have not tasted sugar in years. An American soldier kneels and holds out a small, brown bar wrapped in paper, chocolate, standard ration issue. A little girl takes it slowly. She looks at it, then at her mother. The mother does not nod. She only watches. The girl's face tightens. Her eyes fill with tears. She drops the chocolate into the dirt and steps back, shaking. Nearby, another child begins crying too. Years of war had taught them one simple rule. The enemy does not give gifts, and that belief was built long before American boots ever touched Japanese soil. By late 1944, Japan was already fighting a war it could no longer sustain. Years earlier, Japan had built its expansion on speed, naval strength, and early shock victories across Asia and the Pacific. But by the end of 1944, that momentum was gone. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost most of its experienced pilots and much of its carrier fleet. American submarines were cutting supply lines across the Pacific, sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could replace them. Food was becoming a weapon. Even before bombs fell, Japan depended heavily on imported rice, oil, and raw materials from occupied territories. As American naval pressure tightened, those shipments slowed, then nearly stopped. Fishing fleets were restricted because fuel was scarce. Farmers lacked fertilizer. Urban populations began living on strict ration systems that kept shrinking month after month. By early 1945, many civilians were already underfed. Children showed clear signs of malnutrition. Schools quietly adjusted physical activity expectations because students simply did not have the strength. At the same time, the war moved closer to Japan's home islands. In March 1945, American B-29 bombers began sustained firebombing campaigns against major Japanese cities. These were not precision military strikes. They were designed to destroy industrial zones built inside residential areas. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller cities burned. Entire neighborhoods disappeared overnight. Families fled to rural areas when possible. Those who stayed often lived in partially destroyed homes, underground shelters, or temporary wooden structures built from debris. Infrastructure collapsed. Water systems failed. Food storage burned. For children growing up in this environment, war was not a distant concept. It was daily life: sirens, smoke, hunger, displacement. Alongside physical destruction came information control. The Japanese wartime government ran one of the most strict propaganda systems of the era. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, school lessons, and public messaging all repeated similar themes. The United States was described as brutal, immoral, and capable of extreme cruelty toward civilians. Children were taught simplified versions of these ideas. The enemy was unpredictable. The enemy used tricks. The enemy poisoned wells. The enemy could disguise danger as kindness. These messages were not always specific, but they created a constant background fear. By mid-1945, Japanese society was also preparing civilians for possible invasion. Local defense groups trained with bamboo spears. School drills included emergency evacuation and basic survival instructions. Even young students were told they might need to sacrifice themselves for the nation. This created a psychological environment where survival depended on suspicion. Then came summer 1945. American forces captured Okinawa after one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Casualties were massive on both sides. But for Japanese civilians, Okinawa carried another message. It showed what might happen if the war reached the main islands. Rumors spread quickly. Stories, some real, some exaggerated, moved through refugee networks and military families. Then, in August 1945, 2 atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki within days. Japan surrendered. For millions of civilians, the war ended not with celebration, but with shock. Years of messaging had said surrender would mean destruction or enslavement. Instead, American aircraft stopped bombing. And soon, American ships began arriving. No one fully understood what would happen next. And that uncertainty would shape the first fragile moments between American soldiers and Japanese civilians. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice reached the Japanese public for the first time through radio. Many civilians struggled to understand the formal language, but one truth became clear. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. For people who had lived under total war messaging for years, the moment felt unreal. Some expected immediate violence from arriving foreign troops. Others expected mass arrests or forced labor. Few expected organized aid. In the weeks that followed, American occupation forces began landing across Japan under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. The operation was structured, controlled, and fast. Ports, airfields, and communication centers were secured. First, but behind the military precision was a country on the edge of humanitarian collapse. Japan's food system was near total failure by late 1945. Urban residents had already sold personal belongings for rice months earlier. Rural areas were under pressure to produce food without proper tools or fertilizer. Transportation networks were damaged, which made moving food between regions difficult. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was expected to be catastrophic. Occupation authorities quickly realized that starving civilians could lead to unrest, disease outbreaks, and long-term instability. Feeding the population became both a humanitarian and strategic priority. The United States began shipping large quantities of emergency food supplies into Japan. These included wheat flour, canned meat, powdered milk, and chocolate. Chocolate was not considered luxury. It was compact, high-calorie, and easy to distribute. For American soldiers, handing out chocolate felt normal. Many had received similar rations throughout the war. For Japanese children, it was something completely unfamiliar. Most had never seen Western chocolate before. Sugar itself had been scarce for years. Packaging printed in English only added to the mystery. At the same time, cultural distance remained huge. Many American soldiers were told to remain professional and cautious. Some were warned that civilians might resent them or even attempt small-scale resistance. Japanese civilians were told to cooperate with occupation forces, but deep fear still existed. Rumors spread quickly. Some people believed the Americans might sterilize food. Others believed aid would come with hidden conditions. Language barriers made every interaction slower and more uncertain. A simple act like handing food to a child could carry layers of misunderstanding. Was it safe? Was it a test? Was it a trick? Medical teams working with occupation forces began documenting widespread malnutrition, especially among children. Some showed signs of vitamin deficiencies. Others had stunted growth from years of food shortage. American aid workers and military doctors often described these early encounters as emotionally difficult. Many had expected hostility. Instead, they found fear and exhaustion. For Japanese families, survival had required extreme caution for years. Trusting an enemy soldier, even one offering food, went against everything they had been taught. Yet hunger was stronger than ideology, and slowly, across damaged cities and rural villages, the first small exchanges began. Food handed across language barriers. Care packages left at school entrances. Medical checkups offered to children who had only known wartime. Discipline. These early moments were fragile, awkward, often silent. But they marked the beginning of something neither side had fully prepared for. Direct human contact between former enemies. And in those moments, the war did not end with treaties or signatures. It ended in small personal decisions, like whether a child would accept a piece of chocolate from a foreign soldier. For Japanese children in 1945, war was not politics. It was environment. Many had spent their entire conscious lives inside wartime Japan. Air raid drills were normal. Hunger was normal. Authority was absolute. School systems during the final years of the war placed strong emphasis on loyalty, sacrifice, and distrust of enemy nations. Lessons were simplified for young minds. The enemy was dangerous. The enemy used deception. Survival meant obedience and caution. When defeat came suddenly in August 1945, those beliefs did not disappear overnight. Children who saw American soldiers for the first time were not meeting strangers. They were meeting figures that had been built in their minds for years. Then came the physical reality. Starvation changes how people think. Medical studies from the period show malnourished children often had heightened anxiety responses. Sudden new foods could trigger fear rather than excitement. Chocolate, in particular, was strange. Dark color, strong smell, sweetness that many children had not tasted in years. Wrapped in foreign paper with unreadable text. In that moment, refusing the chocolate was not irrational. It was survival logic shaped by war. For some children, crying was not about the food itself. It was the collapse of everything familiar. And yet, hunger remained. Some children watched others eat first. Some waited for adults to approve. Some hid food for later testing. These small decisions became the first cracks in years of psychological conditioning. Many American soldiers arriving in Japan expected tension, maybe hostility. They had spent years fighting an enemy described as disciplined, loyal, and unwilling to surrender. Battles across the Pacific had been intense and often brutal, but occupation duty felt different almost immediately. Instead of resistance, soldiers often saw destroyed cities, damaged infrastructure, and civilians focused only on survival. Handing out rations became one of the most direct forms of interaction. Chocolate was common because soldiers often carried extra portions. Some gave them away casually. Others gave them intentionally, hoping to build trust. Diaries and letters from occupation troops often describe surprise at civilian reactions. Some soldiers expected children to run toward food. Instead, they saw hesitation, fear, silence. For many soldiers, this became the first time they saw the human cost of total war from the civilian side. Some described feeling uncomfortable being treated like something dangerous rather than something helpful. Over time, many soldiers adjusted. They learned to move slower, offer food indirectly, let local adults distribute it first. These small behavioral shifts helped reduce fear, but early encounters often remained awkward and emotionally heavy. Feeding civilians was not only charity, it was strategy. Occupation planners understood history. Starving populations create instability. Instability can lead to violence, black markets, and political radicalization. The United States wanted a stable post-war Japan. That meant rebuilding trust, public health, and basic living conditions as fast as possible. Food distribution programs were designed carefully. Schools became central distribution points. Medical teams tracked child nutrition levels. Chocolate and sweets, while small, had symbolic value. They showed abundance. They showed a future different from wartime scarcity. Over time, these programs helped shift public perception. The occupying force was still foreign, still powerful, but it was no longer only associated with destruction. These policies helped create the foundation for long, term political and economic rebuilding, and yet, policy alone could not change emotions overnight, because deeper fears still lived in memory, in language, and in the silent space between two people who had only known each other as enemies out by 1945. Japanese civilians had lived under more than a decade of tightly controlled information. News from the outside world was filtered, shaped, and often delayed. Propaganda was not always loud or extreme. Often, it was quiet repetition. The enemy was dangerous. The enemy could not be trusted. The enemy might use kindness as a weapon. For children, these ideas blended into normal reality. They were repeated in classrooms, newspapers, and public messaging. Even when not spoken directly, they lived inside daily conversation. When the war ended, the information system collapsed almost overnight. But belief systems do not collapse as quickly as governments. Rumors filled the gap. Some civilians believed Americans might poison water supplies. Others believed foreign medicine could cause sickness. Stories spread without proof, but in a country exhausted by war, fear spread faster than facts. So when an American soldier offered chocolate, some children were not reacting to the soldier. They were reacting to years of psychological conditioning. Breaking that fear required time, repetition, and visible proof that the food was safe. Slowly, as children saw others eat without harm, belief systems began to shift. The first meetings between American soldiers and Japanese civilians were often silent. Few soldiers spoke Japanese. Few civilians spoke English. Even basic communication required gestures, pointing, or help from translators who were not always present. Simple moments became complex. Soldiers smiling could be interpreted as friendly or threatening. A child refusing food could be seen as fear, pride, or confusion. Even food itself carried cultural meaning. Chocolate was common in the United States. In Japan, especially after years of shortage, it was unfamiliar. Many children had never tasted anything that sweet. The smell alone could be overwhelming. Packaging also mattered. Foreign writing on wrappers made the food feel more distant, more unknown. Over time, translators, teachers, and local officials helped bridge these gaps. Schools became safe meeting spaces where food could be introduced slowly. Teachers sometimes ate first in front of students. These small acts created shared understanding without words. When combat ends, another kind of conflict often begins. The fight over memory, identity, and trust. For Japan in 1945, defeat created deep national trauma. For the United States, victory created responsibility. Occupation forces had to prove they were not the enemy image built during the war. Civilians had to decide whether survival required cooperation or resistance. Children became the first testing ground of this new reality. If children accepted food, parents watched closely. If children stayed safe, communities slowly relaxed. This was not immediate forgiveness. It was cautious observation. Many Japanese civilians cooperated because survival required it. But over time, repeated peaceful interaction began to change emotional responses. A soldier giving chocolate could not erase years of war, but it could create one new memory that did not match the old fear, and memory, once changed, can reshape entire generations. These slow emotional shifts set the stage for the most important moment, the moment when fear and reality finally faced each other directly. In food lines, schoolyards, and temporary aid stations across occupied Japan. By late 1945, food distribution in Japan had moved from emergency improvisation to organized systems. Ports in Yokohama, Kobe, and other major entry points were receiving steady shipments of aid supplies. From there, food moved through rail lines when possible, or by military truck convoys when infrastructure was damaged. Schools became one of the most important distribution centers, not only because children were vulnerable, but because schools provided structure, routine, and local trust. American military medical teams often worked alongside Japanese teachers and local officials. Height and weight measurements were taken. Vitamin deficiency symptoms were recorded. In some areas, doctors documented children fainting during normal daily activity due to low calorie intake. Food lines became common scenes, children standing in rows, bowls or small containers in hand. Some wearing shoes made from cloth or rope. Many wearing clothing repaired dozens of times. For American soldiers, these scenes often felt heavier than combat memories. There was no enemy movement, no incoming fire. Just quiet waiting. Chocolate was rarely given as the main food source. It was usually distributed alongside more basic staples. But its impact was often immediate. The first moments usually followed a pattern. A soldier would hold out the chocolate, sometimes directly to a child, sometimes through a teacher or local official. The child would hesitate. Sometimes they accepted it, but did not eat it. Sometimes they looked to an adult first. Sometimes they hid it inside clothing. Medical teams and occupation officials began noticing this pattern across multiple regions. Reports described children showing curiosity mixed with visible fear. In some documented cases, children cried while holding food they clearly wanted, not because the food was bad, because the act itself conflicted with everything they had been taught. One U.S. medical officer wrote that some children treated new food the same way they treated unknown medicine, something that might help or might harm. Teachers played a critical role in breaking this barrier. In several documented school feeding programs, teachers would eat the same food first in front of students. This was not theatrical. It was practical. Teachers already held trust authority. If the teacher ate and remained safe, students were more likely to follow. In some areas, American soldiers learned to step back physically. Instead of handing food directly, they placed it on tables or let local adults handle distribution. These small changes reduced emotional pressure on children. Winter made everything more urgent. Cold weather increased calorie needs. Illness spread faster among undernourished populations. Aid distribution had to move faster and reach deeper into rural areas. American and Japanese officials worked together to map the most vulnerable communities. In many places, chocolate and other high-calorie foods became emergency supplements for children who were already dangerously underweight. But the real turning point was not nutritional. It was emotional. The moment a child ate the chocolate and nothing bad happened, then another child, then another, fear did not disappear instantly, but it weakened. Parents watched closely. Communities talked quietly about what they saw. The enemy who bombed cities was now also the soldier who handed food to hungry children. This contradiction forced a slow psychological shift, and as winter deepened, more children crossed that invisible line between fear and survival. Because hunger leaves very little space for ideology, and once that line was crossed, it changed more than one moment. It began changing how an entire generation understood the word enemy. By early 1946, something subtle but powerful had begun changing across occupied Japan. Food lines were still long. Cities were still damaged. Many families were still rebuilding daily life from almost nothing. But inside schools and community aid centers, the emotional atmosphere was slowly shifting. Children who had once refused foreign food were now eating it more openly. School feeding programs expanded. American aid shipments increased through the winter months. Wheat flour became common in school meals. Powdered milk, often unfamiliar at first, was mixed into soups or drinks. Chocolate and sweets were still limited, but when available, they were often used to encourage attendance at feeding centers. Teachers reported measurable changes. Attendance improved in areas with regular food programs. Children had more energy. Concentration improved. Illness rates slowly dropped in regions receiving consistent aid. For American occupation planners, this was more than nutrition success. It was stability. A fed population was less likely to panic, less likely to turn to black markets, and more likely to cooperate with rebuilding efforts. But for civilians, especially children, the change was more personal. The same soldiers who once represented fear were now part of daily routine. Trucks arriving with supplies, medical teams checking growth and health, translators helping coordinate distribution. Many soldiers remained cautious and professional. But over time, repeated peaceful interaction replaced the first tense encounters. Children began approaching soldiers instead of hiding. In some towns, children began practicing English phrases, simple greetings, requests for food or candy. These were small cultural openings, but they mattered. Medical records from the period show steady improvement in child nutrition across major population centers through 1946. The progress was not uniform. Rural areas often recovered slower. But the overall trend was clear. The occupation was no longer only military presence. It was daily survival support. Trust did not arrive all at once. Some families remained deeply suspicious. Some communities limited interaction as much as possible. But for many children, memory was already shifting. Their first memory of Americans might include bombing stories told by parents. But their first direct memory might be a soldier giving food, and childhood memories often shape long-term national perception more than political speeches. By mid-1946, school-based feeding and medical programs were helping stabilize Japan's younger generation. Malnutrition rates dropped in major cities. Infant survival improved in areas with access to aid food and medical care. At the same time, occupation authorities pushed broader rebuilding programs, restoring rail systems, supporting agriculture recovery, and stabilizing food transport networks. The emotional turning point had already happened months earlier. The moment fear met reality and did not confirm the fear. Moment children learned that the enemy could also help them survive. These changes did not erase war trauma. They did not erase loss, destruction, or grief, but they created space for something new, a fragile foundation where former enemies could exist in the same space without immediate fear. And from that fragile beginning, something much larger would eventually grow, a long-term political alliance, economic rebuilding, cultural exchange. But all of that started in moments so small, they were almost invisible to history. A child, a foreign soldier, a piece of chocolate. And the slow realization that the war had truly ended. By late 1946, Japan's food situation was still fragile, but no longer at the edge of collapse. Emergency shipments from the United States and other sources continued to stabilize calorie supply in major population centers. Agricultural recovery programs slowly improved domestic production. Fertilizer imports resumed. Farmers gained better access to tools and fuel. The black market, which had expanded rapidly during the final war year, began shrinking as legal food supply improved. Public health data from the occupation period shows steady improvement in childhood nutrition. Growth rates slowly recovered. Vitamin deficiency diseases became less common in areas receiving consistent aid. Schools remained central to recovery. School feeding programs became routine across many regions. Meals were simple, often soup, bread, or rice mixed with imported wheat. But they were consistent, and consistency mattered more than variety. Teachers reported that children who had once been too weak for physical activity were slowly regaining strength. Classroom focus improved. Absentee rates dropped. For a generation that had spent formative years inside war and hunger, this period became their first experience of predictable daily stability. American occupation leadership saw food and health recovery as the base layer for everything else. Economic reform, political restructuring, and infrastructure rebuilding all depended on a population healthy enough to work, learn, and rebuild. Medical cooperation between American and Japanese doctors also expanded. Disease tracking systems improved. Vaccination programs reached wider civilian populations. Infant survival rates began rising in major cities. Psychologically, recovery moved slower than physical health. Many adults carried deep trauma from bombing, loss of family members, and total national defeat. But children, especially those under 10 during surrender, adapted faster. For them, post-war memory formed alongside occupation presence. Not only war memory. This generational difference would later shape Japan's post-war social and political outlook. Food distribution also created daily contact between civilians and occupation personnel. Over time, routine replaced tension. Soldiers delivering supplies became predictable figures instead of unknown threats. Translators, doctors, and aid workers became familiar faces in schools and clinics. These repeated interactions slowly reshaped civilian perception of foreign presence, not into full trust immediately, but into something more stable than fear. At the same time, Japanese government institutions, working under occupation supervision, began rebuilding national food management systems. Rail repairs improved internal transport. Coastal shipping slowly resumed. By 1947, emergency food dependency was beginning to decline. Though shortages still existed, but the most lasting effect was not only agricultural or economic. It was psychological normalization. Children, who once feared foreign food, now expected school meals as part of normal life, and this shift created the foundation for something much larger than short-term recovery. It created the first generation of Japanese citizens whose earliest clear memories of the United States were not combat, but aid. And that generational shift would quietly shape Japan's future role in the world. By the late 1940s, Japan was no longer only surviving. It was rebuilding. Cities that had been reduced to burned foundations were slowly filling with new construction. Rail lines that once carried military cargo now carried civilian goods. Markets reopened. Schools expanded. The occupation formally ended in 1952, but by that point, the relationship between Japan and the United States had already changed in ways few people in 1945 could have imagined. Political cooperation grew first. Security agreements placed American forces in Japan as defense partners rather than occupiers. Japan, limited by its post-war constitution, shifted away from large-scale military expansion and toward economic recovery and industrial growth. But these political decisions were built on something quieter: public acceptance. For many older civilians, memories of bombing and war loss remained dominant. But for younger generations, memory was more mixed. They remembered hunger. They remembered fear. But many also remembered aid lines, school meals, medical checkups, foreign soldiers who did not act like the enemies described during wartime. These layered memories helped soften public resistance to long-term cooperation between the two countries. Cultural exchange grew slowly but steadily. American films, music, and consumer goods entered Japanese markets. Japanese industry began adapting foreign technology while rebuilding domestic production capacity. By the 1950s and 1960s, Japan's economic growth accelerated. Manufacturing, electronics, and automotive industries expanded rapidly. Historians often point to economic policy, industrial planning, and global trade access as key reasons for Japan's recovery. But social stability was equally important. A population willing to rebuild, work, and cooperate with international systems creates the foundation for economic success. And part of that stability came from the way the occupation managed civilian survival in its earliest phase. Psychological shift inside children who grew up during the occupation years had long-term effects. Many grew into adults who viewed the United States not only as a former enemy, but also as a post-war partner. This did not erase national pride or cultural identity. Japan rebuilt its own path, its own economy, and its own global presence, but it did reduce the intensity of long-term hostility that often follows total war. Personal memory plays a powerful role in national history. And for thousands of Japanese civilians, one of the first personal memories of the post-war world involved receiving food from someone they had once been taught to fear. That memory did not solve everything, but it made cooperation possible. And cooperation, over time, helped reshape one of the most destructive conflicts in human history into one of the most stable international partnerships of the modern era. And all of it leads to the final question: what does it mean when war ends? But fear does not end at the same time. War does not end the moment weapons fall silent. It ends slowly, inside people, inside memory, inside the quiet space where fear either survives or fades. In Japan after 1945, fear did not disappear with surrender. It lived in burned cities, in empty food stores, in children who had learned that survival meant distrusting everything unfamiliar. A piece of chocolate seems small in the scale of world history. It does not rebuild cities. It does not sign treaties. It does not erase loss, but history is often shaped by small, human moments, moments where reality challenges belief. For many Japanese children, the first post-war test of that reality came through food. Something offered by someone they had been taught to see as dangerous. Something that could either confirm years of fear or quietly begin replacing it. Trust does not arrive through speeches. It arrives through repetition, through survival, through seeing again and again that yesterday's enemy does not act like the enemy you imagined. The Pacific War reshaped the world through destruction, technology, and massive loss of life, but its ending was defined in part by something much quieter. Children learning that survival sometimes requires letting go of what you were taught to fear. And in the decades that followed, those children became the adults who rebuilt Japan, adults who helped turn a defeated nation into one of the world's strongest economies, adults who helped build a long, complicated, but stable peace between former enemies. Because sometimes history changes not through victory or defeat, but through the moment someone accepts food from a former enemy and realizes they are still alive the next morning.